America needs money, lots of money. America needs money because it owes nearly $40 trillion. Every year, the government borrows more. Every year, interest payments get larger. And every year, economic growth becomes more important because growth is what keeps the system moving. Growth creates jobs. Growth generates tax revenue. Growth attracts investment. And perhaps most importantly, growth buys time. Now, at first glance, none of this has anything to do with football, but that's where things get interesting. Because right now, millions of people are preparing to travel to the United States for the biggest World Cup in history. They're booking flights, reserving hotels, buying tickets, planning vacations, and bringing billions of dollars with them. Most people see a football tournament. Economists see something else: foreign spending, foreign capital, economic activity. The kind of activity America desperately wants more of, which raises an uncomfortable question. What if World Cup 2026 isn't just a sporting event? What if it's arriving at exactly the moment America needs the world most? Because behind the stadiums, the celebrations, and the billions of viewers lies a much bigger story. A story about debt, a story about growth, and a story about why the world's largest economy may be relying on the world's biggest sporting event far more than anyone realizes. To understand why, we need to start with a number that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore: $40 trillion. That's roughly how much debt the United States government owes. It's a number so large that most people struggle to understand what it actually means. A million seconds is about 11 days. A billion seconds is roughly 31 years. A trillion seconds is more than 31,000 years. Now multiply that by 40. That's the scale we're talking about. For decades, America has been able to borrow money more easily than almost any country in history. Whenever Washington needed money, investors around the world were willing to lend it. And for a long time, that wasn't a major problem. Interest rates remained low, the economy continued growing, and the debt, while large, remained manageable. But then something changed. Inflation returned, interest rates increased, and suddenly the cost of carrying all that debt began climbing rapidly. Today, the United States spends an astonishing amount of money every year simply paying interest on money it has already borrowed. Think about that for a moment. Not building roads, not funding schools, not investing in infrastructure, just paying interest. It's the financial equivalent of making minimum payments on a credit card that never seems to get smaller. And the larger the debt becomes, the larger those interest payments become as well. That's why economists aren't just focused on debt anymore. They're focused on growth, because growth is what makes debt manageable. Imagine two people who each owe $100,000. One earns $20,000 a year, the other earns $200,000 a year. The debt is exactly the same, but the burden is completely different. The same principle applies to countries. If the economy grows, debt becomes easier to carry. If growth slows, the debt becomes much heavier. And that's exactly why policymakers care so much about economic activity. They need businesses spending, they need consumers spending, they need investors investing, and perhaps most importantly, they need the rest of the world spending money in America. Which brings us back to World Cup 2026. Because unlike most economic stimulus programs, the World Cup doesn't rely on government spending. It relies on something else: visitors, millions of them. Fans traveling from Europe, fans traveling from South America, fans traveling from Asia, fans traveling from Africa, all arriving with wallets ready to spend. Think about what happens when a football fan travels halfway around the world. They buy airline tickets, they book hotels, they eat in restaurants, they use taxis, they buy merchandise, they visit tourist attractions, they spend money almost everywhere they go. And unlike domestic spending, much of that money is coming from outside the United States. That's why economists love international tourism, because it injects new money directly into local economies. It's one of the few forms of economic activity where the money genuinely arrives from elsewhere. And World Cup 2026 could become one of the largest tourism events in modern American history. The tournament itself is unprecedented. 48 teams, more than 100 matches, millions of expected visitors, a television audience measured in billions. No World Cup has ever been this large, which means no World Cup has ever carried economic expectations this large either. Cities across the United States are preparing for an enormous influx of visitors. Hotels are expanding capacity. Airlines are increasing routes. Restaurants are preparing for record demand. Local governments are investing millions in planning and operations. Everyone is preparing for a boom. And on paper, it makes sense. If millions of visitors arrive and spend money, local economies should benefit. Businesses should benefit. Workers should benefit. Tax revenues should increase. The economic opportunity appears obvious. But here's where things become more complicated, because economists have a habit of ruining exciting stories. Whenever politicians talk about economic benefits, economists start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, how much of that spending is actually new? How much would have happened anyway? And who ultimately receives the biggest share of the benefits? These questions matter because the economic impact of sporting events has a long and complicated history. Before almost every major sporting event, forecasts predict enormous economic benefits. And before almost every major sporting event, politicians proudly repeat those forecasts. Sometimes those predictions are accurate, sometimes they're not. The reason is surprisingly simple. Economic activity and economic benefit are not always the same thing. Imagine a tourist from Germany who is already planning to visit New York in 2026. Instead of visiting later in the year, they choose to visit during the World Cup. The spending still happens. Hotels still get paid. Restaurants still make money. But was that spending actually created by the tournament, or was it simply moved from one month to another? Economists call this the substitution effect, and it appears more often than many people realize. Then there's another challenge: crowding out. While some tourists arrive because of the World Cup, other tourists may stay away. Hotel prices rise. Flights become more expensive. Cities become crowded. Some visitors decide to postpone their trips or choose different destinations altogether, which means some of the spending generated by World Cup fans may replace spending that would have happened anyway. This doesn't mean the World Cup won't benefit the economy. It almost certainly will. But it does mean the final numbers are often smaller than the headlines suggest. And that's where we'll pick up in the next chapter. Because once you follow the money, an even bigger question emerges. If billions of dollars are expected to flow through the American economy during World Cup 2026, who actually gets the money? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Hotels get the money. Restaurants get the money, airlines get the money, local businesses get the money. And to some extent, that's true. But before any of those businesses can benefit, something has to happen first. The visitors actually need to arrive. And that is where economists are beginning to raise concerns, because while organizers continue projecting millions of international visitors, some analysts are asking whether those expectations are realistic. Not because football fans aren't interested, not because tickets aren't selling, but because traveling to the United States has become increasingly expensive, increasingly complicated, and for some visitors, increasingly uncertain. Consider what an international fan faces today. Airfare is significantly more expensive than it was just a few years ago. Hotel prices in many host cities have risen sharply. Food and transportation costs remain elevated, and for visitors from many countries, obtaining permission to enter the United States can involve lengthy visa processes and significant waiting times. Individually, none of these obstacles seem fatal. Together, they create friction, and friction has a habit of reducing demand. That's important because the economic projections surrounding World Cup 2026 assume that millions of international visitors will actually make the trip. If those visitor numbers fall even modestly below expectations, the economic impact could look very different from what politicians and organizers have promised. This is particularly important for cities like Miami. For years, Miami has been positioned as one of the biggest economic winners of the tournament. The city already attracts millions of international visitors annually, its economy is heavily tied to tourism, and many local businesses are expecting a significant boost from the World Cup. But economists studying tourism trends have pointed out an uncomfortable reality. The success of cities like Miami depends less on football itself and more on the willingness of international visitors to spend money there. And right now, there are signs that some of those visitors may be reconsidering their plans. To understand why, we need to think like a traveler. Imagine you're a football fan living in Argentina, or Brazil, or Nigeria, or India. You've dreamed about attending a World Cup for years. The tournament is finally coming. Your national team qualifies. You want to be there. But before you even think about buying a match ticket, you need to answer a much simpler question. Can you actually get into the country? For many travelers, that answer is easy. For others, it isn't. Visa waiting times remain a challenge in several parts of the world. Application procedures can be lengthy, rules can change, requirements can vary, and uncertainty has a way of discouraging people long before they ever reach the airport. This is one of the reasons tourism experts have become increasingly focused on immigration policy. Not because immigration determines who loves football, but because immigration determines who can easily participate in the economic opportunity surrounding football. And that distinction matters because the World Cup isn't just selling tickets, it's selling travel, it's selling tourism, it's selling experiences, and all of those things depend on people crossing borders. The irony is that the United States may be hosting the largest World Cup in history at the exact moment international travel has become more complicated than many expected. The numbers help explain why. A family of 4 traveling internationally for the World Cup could easily spend thousands of dollars before ever entering a stadium. Flights, hotels, transportation, food, entertainment, match tickets, travel insurance. The costs add up quickly. Now add visa fees, administrative delays, additional uncertainty. Suddenly, what started as a dream vacation becomes a major financial commitment. And when people face major financial commitments, some inevitably decide not to proceed. That doesn't mean the tournament will fail. Far from it. The stadiums will almost certainly be full. The television audience will likely be enormous. The World Cup remains one of the most powerful events in global sports. But the question economists care about isn't whether fans will come. The question is whether enough fans will come to justify the economic expectations attached to the tournament, because those expectations have become enormous. Some projections suggest the World Cup could generate billions of dollars in economic activity across North America. Those forecasts assume strong tourism demand, strong consumer spending, strong international participation. But forecasts are only as reliable as the assumptions behind them. And if one of those assumptions changes, the entire calculation changes with it. This brings us back to America's broader economic situation. Remember the debt. Remember the growth problem. Remember why policymakers care so much about economic activity. America doesn't need the World Cup to survive. The United States economy is far too large for a football tournament to fundamentally change its trajectory. But that doesn't mean the World Cup is irrelevant. Far from it. In an environment where governments are searching for growth, businesses are searching for customers, and cities are searching for investment, every additional dollar matters. Every tourist matters. Every hotel booking matters. Every international visitor matters. That's why economists pay attention to these details. Because when millions of visitors are involved, even small changes in behavior can produce surprisingly large economic consequences. A 5% decline in visitor numbers might not sound dramatic, but across millions of expected travelers, that can translate into hundreds of millions of dollars in spending. And that's where the real gamble begins to reveal itself. The gamble was never about football. Nobody doubts that people love football. The gamble is about expectations. It's about whether the economic boom being advertised today will look the same once the tournament is over. Because history has shown that major sporting events often create excitement long before they create results. Before every Olympics, before every World Cup, before every mega event, forecasts promise enormous benefits. Sometimes those benefits materialize, sometimes they don't, and usually the truth lands somewhere in between. Which means the most important question surrounding World Cup 2026 may not be who wins the trophy. It may be whether the economic projections survive contact with reality. Because if fewer visitors arrive than expected, if tourism spending falls short of forecasts, and if immigration barriers discourage even a small percentage of international travelers, the economic story of World Cup 2026 could end up looking very different from the one being told today. And if that happens, America won't just be hosting the biggest World Cup in history. It will be learning a very expensive lesson about the difference between economic projections and economic reality. And that's a gamble nobody can fully evaluate until the final whistle blows.